Das lieber nicht machen. Yes, doctor. Aber diese Hashtags drauf.
Yeah.
No, but refugee has like 22%. And Social Democrats are Austria 27%.
In Lower Saxony we are Social Democrats by 35, 36. So I hope that keeps like that. We'll see up to October.
So, welcome to our second debate today. We are very glad to have you here in the Parliament in Denmark. And thank you for the Minister for welcoming us all in Denmark. So, today we have a very important topic dealing with migration policy, human rights, and what possible solutions we have moving forward also in Europe. And we are very glad to welcome two ministers. Thanks a lot for being here, for your time. I'll hand over the matter to my colleague who will moderate the debate today.
Thank you for that. Yes, also a warm welcome from me and to the panels and to you. We're really glad that you could make it today. I will start by shortly introducing you, very shortly, and then we will have a round of opening statements by each of you, and we'll start with you, Mr. Boris Pistorus. But I will first give an introduction to the panel. So first off, we have you, Mr. Boris Pistorius, State Minister of Interior in Lower Saxony, Germany. German lawyer, politician from the SPD, and you serve as State Minister of Interior, and you've been in the government since 2013. And you were also very involved in this coalition agreement from last year, which we will also get back to later. Then we have Mr. Dybvad, the new Danish Immigration and Integration Minister, and congratulations with that. And yes, so you're a member of Parliament for the Social Democrats in Denmark since 2015. And in 19 you were Minister of Housing, and then, well, in January 21, then you switched to this new ministry. So then we have Gerald Knaus, who is chair of the European Stability Initiative, who was also here for our previous discussion. From Austria, founding chairman of ACI, working on South of Europe and migration policy, judicial independence, the rule of law, and many important topics, and the future of foreign policy. And also ACI proposed the 2016 EU-Turkey agreement and other third-party agreements for humane control. And without further ado, then I will give the floor to you, Mr. Pistorius, for your opening statement.
Thanks a lot, and thank you for the invitation here, Gerald. I'm really pleased to be here and to take the opportunity to discuss about one of the most important topics, I think, for the following 2 decades at least. But first, let me say I have to apologize for my English. I'm not used to speak English every week, and not even every month, so sometimes I will be searching for some words, but we'll find a way. So the first information for you. Second one, to give you a short overview about Lower Saxony. Lower Saxony is a country state in the northern part of Germany with about 8 million inhabitants, so round about as big as Austria. And I am now in office, as you mentioned already, since 2013. And that means that I'm up to now, there are only 3 ministers of the interior among 17 who are longer in office than me. I'm a member of the board of the Social Democratic Party on the federal level, and in that function I negotiated as the head of the Social Democratic delegation the negotiations for the coalition treaty in autumn last year, and I'm very satisfied with that, with the result, especially because I learned afterwards how unsatisfied the conservative opposition in Germany is with that treaty. That means the treaty must be very good. So far. Let's have a short look on the actual situation considering the Ukraine. I was really overwhelmed by the willingness and the helpfulness of people all over Europe, especially of course in Germany, like always, and in Lower Saxony, but in this case it has to be mentioned especially in Poland. They took in more than 3 million people from the Ukraine. The people flew war and bombs and anything, and left many things behind, their husbands, their friends, their families. And Germany took in up to now about 600,000 refugees from Ukraine. Among almost 10%, a little bit more than 10% stayed in Germany, in Lower Saxony. And in between just 2 weeks or something like that, we set up a distribution hub in Hanover at the fair to distribute all the people arriving in Germany, mainly first in Berlin, and then they continued to distribute them all over Germany. I'm really happy with what I can watch, how people deal with that situation once more after 7 years after the great crisis, the big crisis in 1516. And this is really giving me a good feeling about humanity and humanitarian and empathy of the people in Europe. And still, let us have a short view on 1516. The situation was quite different. We had to do with about 900, or a little bit more than 900,000 refugees, asylum seekers from Syria and other countries in between August 2015 to December 2016. And the willingness to help was very big in the beginning too, except in some countries in the eastern part of Europe who rather fast refused to take any refugees with Muslim religion. This was a real problem. It is up to now because we will face another migration movement in the next decades, and then again with people who are not Ukrainian Christian people. So the problem is not away, it's just a little bit hidden, I think. So what are we talking about? I think all of us in Europe and even in other regions of the world, we have to face that if we don't understand that we need a culture of welcoming people, a spirit of being able and willing to help because of human reasons, then we will then we can't be successful in recruiting people who work in our countries. And if we don't succeed that, we will really have a serious demographic problem during the next years. Only in Germany we need every year at least 400,000 labor migrants every year, at least. Condition, we get more women in work. If we don't succeed in that, we need even 500 or 600,000. So this is a huge number. I just was in Canada and talked to the Minister of Migration over there, and he told me they just decided to take in every year 1% of their population as labor migrants. That means in Canada 400,000 too. And they even have the purpose to increase their population up to 2040-50 from now 37 to 100 million inhabitants by migration. This is a totally different approach to what we see in Europe. It's different, it's not in any aspect comparable, of course, but still, our approach is a little bit negative, I think. Most of us, most in Europe, really have an approach very negative, focus on the threats, focus on the problems. Of course there are problems, of course integration doesn't work fine everywhere and every time. But still I think the advantages for all, for the people we help and for us, for our societies is much bigger. And therefore I think we should commit to a very simple sentence. We need a asylum system, functioning European asylum system for people who need us, who need our protection. And at the same time, we need an immigration system for all those people we need or those qualification we need. The function must be on both sides, otherwise we won't solve the problems we have. And I'm deeply convinced that we have with our catalogue of values in the European Union, the duty to help help people who are in emergency situations or in emergency situations. Therefore, I think migration is an opportunity, migration is a chance, as long as we don't refuse, or as long as we don't ignore the problems we have. And we have to claim them, we have to mention them, otherwise we won't be able to solve them. So some sentences to our, in the coalition treaty agreed migration politics in Germany. What we want is a paradigm shift. We want to shape migration in a forward-looking and realistic way with an active and regulatory policy. We want and we will reduce irregular migration on the one hand side and enable regular migration. That is the task we have to do. And we stand by our humanitarian responsibility and the obligations arising from international law and so on. So what we do now in our treaty is, we are going now to umsetzen, to implement it now in the coming months, I hope. What we do is we speed up visa issuance. We will increase digitalization. We will how do you say, we will tidy up the complicated system of toleration and create new opportunities for people who have already become members of our society, for example. One example, we have some real problem with the chain of toleration over the years. And now we create a new chance for those people who was already in January 2022, 5 years in Germany without committing any crimes and so on. They get a chance for 1 year to prove they are able to handle their life and to help us to clear the identity as far as it is not yet done. This is very important because we have many people without the identity which is clear. So this is what we are going to do in the coming 3 years. I hope we will manage it because the situation is, as you know, due to the terrible war in the Ukraine, very difficult, and our government in Berlin has some other things to do at the moment than to change laws which will be very disputed in our society. But still, I'm convinced we will and we have to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Then over to our next.
Thank you very much for the invitation. As it was mentioned in the beginning, I'm a bit new in this area, but I hope that I can keep up with all the experienced people here in this panel. First of all, it's not in my papers, but just to say about Ukrainians and displaced people from Ukraine, we also, I think, experience some of the same things as they do in Lower Saxony, which is to say that we scaled up our system to take some 100,000, and now we are balanced around 27,000 in Denmark at the moment, and usually people are lodging with former work migrants from Ukraine. So we have, I think, also some interesting experiences in that field. But I was invited to speak more about the overall picture of refugees to Europe, also of course some of the initiatives that we've been planning as a government. So I think I'll just take that as the main part of my speech here. I think it's important to say that what our ambition is in the Danish government is a vision for a more humane asylum system than the current one. I think we're facing international crisis on protection, and I don't think that the system as it is working now and has been working, for example, in 2015 is viable. And just to put some numbers on that conclusion, from 2014 to 2021, there was around 22,000 migrants who perished along the migration routes to Europe. Many people risk being exposed to violence, abuse, losing their lives, and many try to reach the shores of Europe, but the majority stays behind. Most of the people who are refugees are in the every day people arrive irregularly to Europe. Europol estimates is that some 90% of irregular arrivals to the EU are assisted by human smugglers. And of course they earn fortunes in return, and they destabilize many of the countries where they work. So those who come to European countries are not necessarily the people who are most in need of asylum, and they are also, by using human smugglers, they're also keeping a system and industry that is destabilizing many countries in Northern Africa. We have an overall distorted asylum system that incentivizes people to risk their lives and also favors those who are able to make that long journey and also very expensive journey. And that has been the offset for our plan, our vision to make a different system for asylum in Denmark. There are increasing migratory pressures at the moment from Africa, especially in the Middle East, and we are also facing grave humanitarian crisis in, for example, Afghanistan, that usually leads to outflows to especially Europe. And what we are looking at is also a global food crisis due to the war in Ukraine, especially the production of wheat, which is essential for many countries in Northern Africa. As recent as this week, UNHCR announced new statistics for the number of forcibly displaced people in the world are soon to be published, and it's more than 100 million people who have been driven from their home around the country, around the world, and that's a record high and also alarming number that requires us to adjust our system. The Danish government believes that we need to rethink international asylum systems so we can help more refugees globally better than we do it today, and to make sure that hope and opportunity for people who are in fragile and conflict-afflicted countries, also those that are staying behind. As rich nations, we have a responsibility towards the world's refugees and also towards the nations who are most affected by the challenges that are posed by irregular migration. And at the same time, the legal and uncontrolled migration to the EU challenges the security and also the social cohesion in our societies. So as a responsible government, we have the obligation to protect the social cohesion and also the security in our own societies. We also need to improve the integration efforts for those who are already here in European countries, and this is key when it comes to managing migration. We believe that both goals can be achieved by breaking the current system and the current asylum system and making a more humane and realistic way to get asylum. Our possible solution that we're working with is to put a concrete proposal of establishing a mechanism where spontaneous asylum seekers from third countries that apply for asylum in Denmark would be transferred to a partner country outside the EU area for asylum processing and subsequent protection. I'm well aware that this is not a brand new idea that is invented by Danish social democrats, but we think that it's one of the necessary solutions. Of course, the goal is to remove negative incentive structures and to promote regular and orderly pathways to resettlement of refugees through the UN quota system. Pistorus mentioned Canada as someone to look to, and when you look at their refugee situation, it's also based on the UN quota system, and that's what our mission is as well. It's also a broader government mission that rests on 10 different pillars that are essential in creating a fair and more humane system. For example, by addressing root causes in the regions that people origin from, strengthening external borders and return capabilities, and also enhancing capacity building in countries along the migratory routes. Of course, this must be done by engaging in equal and real partnerships with third countries. This is not something that we can do just by going somewhere and trying to make some quick deal with people. It's something that needs to be in a real partnership and with the real interest from both parts. What we want to do is to also, of course, try to inspire other EU countries. We can make some solutions only from a Danish perspective, but of course in the long run, the best solution would be to do it at a European scale and also change the system as a whole. And of course, that's also why we are very committed to the new discussion on the EU Asylum and Migration Pact, which I think contains many good elements, but we also need we think that more needs to be done to break the incentive structure of irregular migration than what has until now been suggested by the Commission. And one important matter in this is also that the Danish opt-out on the judicial area can make it possible for us to explore the idea of transferring to asylum processing in a safe third country outside of the EU. The status right now is that we are engaged in dialogue with Rwanda on strengthening our partnership on a range of issues based on a broad approach, including political cooperation, development cooperation, migration partnership. We share many common missions in two areas, both in green transition, gender equality, and also need for better protection of refugees. And on the cooperation of asylum and migration, our two governments agreed on the necessity to think in new ways to make it possible to change the current asylum and migration system. Transfer mechanism is part of the discussions with Rwanda and part of a broader vision to create a more humane and dignified approach to protection. Respect of all international obligations is paramount for the cooperation between Rwanda and Denmark, and also will be crucial component of any possible agreement. No deal on transfer mechanism is concluded yet, and we are in the initial stages of our negotiations. I think I'll just stop for now, but as a concluding remark, I note that I am excited to have this frank and open discussion on how together we can create a more fair and humane asylum system. And I think it's important also to just say as the last thing, there will be, of course, issues with any new way to make a more humane asylum system, but we shouldn't forget that what is happening right now in the Mediterranean has been happening for many years now. Our system that is inhumane is essential, and we think that we need to explore new ways of making it possible to handle asylum seekers to Europe. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Loren. Thanks a lot to everyone who's here for this really interesting debate, and thanks to the ministers for these presentations. I would like to pick up exactly where the last presentation left off, which is that the current system is really inhumane. And I want to start with the fact that we have the deadliest borders in the world around Europe, that every year thousands of people are dying and have been dying in large numbers. And I would like to throw out for the debate just a few facts and myths about borders and refugees that might help focus the debate, and then end where Boris Pistorus started, which is the German coalition agreement, and perhaps the chance for Germany, Denmark, and others to push together for a different, more humane system. Let me start with a simple fact. We talk a lot about Ukrainians, rightly. This is the biggest refugee movement in Europe since the 1940s. But the country that hosts most refugees in the world today is still Turkey. The latest numbers from February, 3.7 million Syrians have temporary protection, what we've given Ukrainians in Turkey. Of those, only 1% are in accommodation centers. Everybody else is in cities around the country, and you see some of the numbers for some of the provinces. Now, this is interesting because that means there are a lot of Syrian refugees in Turkey, but almost none of them come to Europe. Here are the numbers of sea arrivals last year to Greece. And what you see here is the total number of Syrians who reached Greece last year by sea was 291 out of the 3.7 million, 291. The total number of people reaching, the total number of people reaching Greece via the sea was less than 4,500. Now, if you think this is because of COVID, no. Because at the same time, you remember last year, 10,000 people crossed the sea from the central Mediterranean just to Italy. So the numbers of people arriving in Italy, numbers of people arriving in Spain has not decreased. It has just decreased in Greece. Why is that? Key fact one, Greece sharply reduced irregular migration following the collapse of the EU-Turkey statement from February 2020. You had 3 phases in the Aegean history of migration, and there you can learn a lot about the options people face. 12 exceptional months, 4 years of cooperation, and since March 2020, an open pushback policy. Here are the numbers of people crossing the Aegean. And what you see is highlighted 12 months, from April to 15 to March to 16, are 12 months in which 1 million people crossed the Aegean. This was exceptional. Now 1 million people crossed into the EU in 1 week from Ukraine, so it's no comparison to what we've seen in the last months. But it was exceptional until then. It never happened before like this. 1 million people in 12 months. In the 4 years after that, exactly 4 years, you see here that the total number was 150,000 in 4 years. So around 30,000 a year. In the 12 months that I described, the first phase, 1,100 people drowned. In the 4 years here, 447 people drowned. You see it here. In the first 12 months, there were no returns to Turkey, 0. In these 4 years, there were 2,100, not many, but some. This was based on the EU-Turkey statement, which was concluded by the EU and Turkey as a press declaration in March 2016. This statement said the following: all migrants have to be treated in line with international standards and the principle of non-refoulement, so there could be no pushbacks. Any application for asylum will be processed individually by Greek authorities in accordance with EU law. So this EU-Turkey statement actually is just a press declaration to say existing law applies. But Turkey was willing, from a cut-off date, to take those back that Greek authorities said were safe. In return, there should be resettlement from Turkey once irregular crossings between Turkey and the EU are ending or have been substantially reduced. A voluntary humanitarian admission scheme will be activated. So the idea was to reduce irregular migration through strategic return after cut-off date, and to take a larger number of people through a humanitarian admission scheme. Finally, the main reason the Turks agreed to this was the promise of visa liberalization. But there were 2 commitments. Turkey had to meet commitments, a list of benchmarks, including improving human rights. That's why it never happened, because that wasn't done by Turkey. And the EU committed that if Turkey meets these benchmarks, it will lift the visa requirement for Turks. That was the incentive for the Turkish Prime Minister to reach this agreement. And Turkey also agreed to prevent new routes and to take the measures to reduce irregular migration. All of this collapsed in February 2020, when President Erdogan sent people with buses to the land border, and the EU responded with Commission President von der Leyen appearing at the Turkish-Greek land border, saying that Greece is Europe's shield. Greece started pushing people back by force without any procedures. One Pakistani migrant was shot in March 2020. Since March, there have been no organized returns to Turkey, 0. Turkey is no longer taking a single person back in an organized way. But there have been tens of thousands of pushbacks at sea. So this is why I say this is the end of the agreement. Everything in the agreement that the sides committed to no longer applies. And here's the problem. This works, reducing numbers extremely well. If you look at the numbers, after March 2020, there are now, and this is why so few Syrians arrive, there are now no more than 200, 300 people arriving in total on all the Aegean islands. each month. Sharp reduction arrivals sea border, sharp reduction arrivals land border. Key fact 2 is then that pushbacks, which work to reduce numbers, involve the systematic violation of the rule of law. What Greece is doing is illegal. This is not in line with EU law. This is not in line with the Refugee Convention. And then it requires executives, including Frontex, to lie to parliaments because they know what is happening. Everybody knows what is happening, but they can't say it. Which is why Mr. Legeri lost his job recently. But he was in an impossible position. If he would have said what he knows, what everybody knows, Greece would have just said, don't stay here, which is what Hungary no longer has Frontex. Poland doesn't want Frontex. Croatia doesn't have Frontex on their borders. They don't want witnesses. So the problem for Frontex is really, if you do your job, you basically see illegality and then you lie about it. If you don't do your job, well, what are your resources for? Greece basically admitted end of last year what it is doing. When the Greek Minister of the Navy said that 29,000 people were saved in the sea by Greek ships, but the Minister of Migration said 4,000 arrived. The other 25,000 end up like this, put on plastic boats, pushed back to Turkey. And this is also in an investigation by Olaf, which came out recently, which investigated this, which showed how boats were then abandoned at sea by the Greek Coast Guard. This investigation played a big role in the pressure on Legeri, the head of Frontex. Another international organization, the Committee for Prevention of Torture, describes what happens regularly at the Croatian-Bosnian border. Violence. Operation Corridor is what it is called by the Croatian police. Beating people up, pushing people back, including a lot of minors. So this breaks every convention and law on the books on how to act at borders. Some European leaders have been very honest, like Viktor Orban. He says he's all in favor of this. He doesn't deny Hungary is doing that too. They keep book. They tell you every month how many they push back to Serbia. And when the European Court found in end 2020 that this was illegal, the Hungarian Minister of Justice said the next day, we don't care. And Mrs. Wagner just said openly, that law, the court is wrong, the law is wrong, we keep doing this. And Hungary keeps doing it. Which was an inspiration for Poland to do the same last year, to legalize their pushbacks to Belarus. So the Polish Prime Minister Morawiecki didn't hide it. He just said, we make a law, and they discussed in Parliament, should we also push back children? And then the opposition said no children, the government said yes, children too, and then they agreed in the law, children too. So this is not even hidden. While in the Central Mediterranean, the EU of course works with the Libyan Coast Guard since 2017, which also involves massive human rights violations. While this is ongoing at the borders, and that's why I totally agree with the Minister that this situation is not sustainable, it's not humane, it's not the rule of law, it's not an acceptable status quo. The EU's border is still the deadliest in the world. Just last year, 2,500 of these people, that's Ireland, died on the way to the EU. So, one third, very short point, that this isn't so unusual in the world. Most countries in the world do that, unfortunately. Australia, for example, is regularly doing pushbacks. Nobody reaches Australia by boat. People are being either until 2014 taken to islands, Nauru and Manus, or pushed back to Indonesia. But people stop coming. But the Australians say, and there they have a point, that people stop dying as well. Israel has had no Syrian refugees. It just put soldiers at the border. People come to Turkey, they come to Lebanon, they come to Jordan, they don't come to Israel. And the US keeps doing pushbacks. Donald Trump, of course, but also his successor. In the first fiscal year under Joe Biden, 1 million people were expelled who crossed the US border into Mexico without procedures under the law on pandemics, Title 42. So the fact that borders can be closed by force, and that countries around the world do it, around Syria, around Afghanistan, that's why so few Afghans get out of Afghanistan. We don't see a big refugee wave because people can't get out. The fact that so few borders can be closed by force also explains why there's so little irregular migration in the world, which is very surprising to many. My last but one fact is this, that the debate on migration and refugees is misleading because we operate with the wrong figures. We have this image that there is always displacement in the world that leads to ever more refugees. And these are the numbers from the UNHCR Global Trend reports every year in June. The last one saying that there were 82.4 million people worldwide displaced at the end of 2020. That's the UNHCR number. But look closer and you find that, well, first of all, that number is very, very dubious. I mean, there are people here included who were displaced 40 years ago, and there were people included that China took from Vietnam in the 1970s, 300,000. But most of them, in any case, are internally displaced. They never crossed the border. Only 26 million, according to UNHCR, were refugees. But of those, 5.7 million are the descendants of Palestinians who left before 1948. So the reality is that 20 million are refugees under UNHCR's mandate. The others never left. They're the grandchildren of people who left before summer 1948. These 20.7 million refugees, however, and that's even more interesting, that number hasn't grown for years. In 2017, there are 20 million. 2018, 20.4, 20.4, 20.7. 700,000 more refugees in 4 years, worldwide. What's going on? How does this fit with the image that everybody is moving in large numbers? Well, the answer is even more interesting. Most of those people never cross the border. Because UNHCR also says in its own report that from 2017 to 2020, 320,000 refugee children are born every year to refugee parents. In Germany, in Bangladesh, in Uganda, in Turkey. The reality is that since 2017, very, very few refugees have found safety anywhere in the world. So, to add to what the minister said, we have a very inhumane system, lots of people die, and very few refugees cross borders. I mean, this is really the worst of all combinations. This is not a good system. Of those refugees who crossed borders since 2013, 9 million, 3 million are just in Turkey. 1 million in Uganda, 1 million in Germany, 1 million in Sudan, roughly. So a few countries have taken them, and those refugees were able to cross because the borders were left open. That's why they could cross. Turkey had 4 years open borders, like the EU now for the Ukrainians. And that is why this is the fastest displacement since 1971, the Bangladesh crisis that we've seen. So to sum up, Greece has reduced irregular migration by force. This has been based on a violation of EU rule of law. Pushbacks are becoming the normal, which is deeply concerning. And myths about refugees confuse the debate. But the question, and I conclude with this, is how are humane borders and control possible? What are humane borders? Humane borders are borders where nobody is treated cruelly to deter arrivals. So unlike Nauru or Manus or Lesbos. Nobody is pushed back into danger without checking, and irregular migration is reduced, so less people die. The coalition agreement in Berlin is trying to square this circle. And here is what it said. The German government wants to respect the law. There should be no pushbacks. There should be, again, sea rescues. There should be an end to the deaths at sea. There should be more regular migration and resettlement, and this should be produced by a coalition of the willing in the EU, if it's not possible with everyone. But it says twice, there should be a reduction of irregular migration. So just like Denmark, irregular migration should be reduced. How do you do that? The agreement says that this can be reduced through returns to a safe country, making attractive offers to countries. So in the central Mediterranean, the only way to save lives and protect human dignity is not to work with Libya, but it's neither to go back to 2016 when 180,000 people were rescued, but 4,600 died. You need to find a safe country to whom you can return people. And if you do it in the Mediterranean, you can rescue lives, especially if you also do resettlement and keep the right to asylum. So here is the summary of the proposal. You have strategic returns from a cut-off date. You say we return people now to stop encouraging people to get in boats. But you have asylum wherever people are. So if people would be taken to Tunisia, there would need to be a fair asylum system there, and you could, why not, ask the UNHCR to do it. They do it in Egypt or Malaysia. You do resettlement so that more refugees get protection. Many more than now could be legally taken from countries without smugglers. And you create incentives for third countries, as we've offered to Turkey, like visa-free travel. In the Aegean, such cooperation would require a new EU-Turkey statement. In the central Mediterranean, it would require partners in North Africa other than Libya, for example, Tunisia. The big challenge is to make this work practically. Can it be made to work? I think there is a convergence of interests between countries and governments in Denmark or Italy or Germany or France, because this would actually produce humane borders. And if you want to find the sources for the numbers or more information, you find it over here. Thank you.
Very insightful, but rather depressing figures, I would say, but very insightful for the purpose of this conversation. Yes, so I think I will give you both the chance to respond to this analysis and the realities, and then your take on how governments in Denmark, in Germany, but also more widely in the European Union, through this hopefully new migration pact that is on its way, although it's taking a long time, how we can solve this. And yes, so Denmark has an opt-out, of course, as you mentioned, on, for example, migration policy, but of course some of the interests are the same. So would you like to start, Mr. Pistorus?
I think the difference between what Gerald told us and what my colleague told us before is that in one case we make an asylum procedure in any third safe place, for example in the Mediterranean area, and with the option in case of accepted appliance to go to Europe. In your case, you want to leave the people in Rwanda or wherever else. You don't let them, even in the case of exception of the appliance, to Denmark, as if I understood you correctly. No, I do?
No, it's based on, of course, taking over refugees the other way.
Okay. Okay. This is a difference. Okay, I was wrong. I think this is exactly the way we have to go. But first and above all, I'm absolutely convinced that we need to commit that must be a European solution. National solutions in the northern part of Europe will not be the solution for anything, because we leave solidarity and we increase the pressure to other European countries because of people who have to leave or to go back from Denmark to any place. For example, the new politics in Denmark with Syrian asylum seekers who left their residence permit and are threatened by deported to Syria with I don't know how it should happen and work out. They come now to Germany. They leave Denmark because they don't want to be in asylum accommodations until they will be deported. They lose their permit to work, and I'm informed, and then they go. They leave Denmark to Germany and to Lower Saxony. And what we face is a problem that the Dublin system would force us to send them back to Denmark. And this is like a ping-pong game on the back of people. And therefore I'm very, very worried about that. And I think Denmark would be well concealed if they didn't go that way alone. Because otherwise we would have to think about the Dublin structure. You're opting out, and your new politics might lead to giving up Dublin, at least for Denmark. Because if we are forced to take all the people feeling forced to leave Denmark, then we got a problem in Middle Europe or another country. So this is it. I don't threaten anybody. I'm just thinking loudly because I think this might be the consequence. Yeah? I don't have the power to do that. This is a matter of the European Commission. But I think it is a danger, a real danger that might happen. And besides that, I'm really convinced if people are going to apply for asylum, either with the perspective of success or not, that depends on the country and so on. They have a right, an international right that we prove that applies. The right for asylum is a human right. Of course, we can't solve all the problems of the world in any region of the world, either in Denmark nor in Germany or Lower Saxony. But we have to guarantee to achieve a fair procedure. wherever it takes place. I absolutely agree with Gerald. We have the main purpose must be to avoid people dying in the sea or otherwise. That must be the first purpose. I think we all agree about that. And then the question is how to achieve that, how to make that possible. And of course it's different between Canada and Germany. Canada, they always told me, it's so easy, we don't let anybody in without having all his data from biometric data and anything. Before we do it, we don't have that, we don't let anybody in. This is quite simple in Canada with two oceans on the left and the red side and the north of Poland in the north and the American border in the south. And I always told them, Germany and Europe, when people come to Europe or to Germany, they are just in front of the door. They just arrive. It's absolutely equal whether they come as refugees or as labor migrants. They are there, and we can't leave them out until we have all biometric data. So this is another problem we have to solve. And I really appeal for a calm hand, but a glowing heart to do that. And of course, a cool mind. Because otherwise, we won't be able to look in the mirror every morning. And at least I don't want to shave myself without looking in the mirror. So therefore, I think let's stay together as a European community. Don't let us don't let us take the risk of national lonely ways.
Well, I think I should answer some of that at least. But first of all, regarding the Syrians, Denmark has taken many Syrian refugees. I don't know the exact number, but as I recall it, we're the 5th largest number per capita in Europe. So
34,000.
Yeah, 34,000. But of course, we're a smaller country than Germany.
Yeah.
I think we're number 5 in Europe, and what we took and gave asylum on the basis of was, of course, that people are refugees, and when they have safe places to return to, they should return to those areas. That is the essence of being a refugee compared to being a migrant, for example. And our assessment now, along with Swedish and British authorities, is that some regions in Syria are safe to return to, and that's why we are asking people to return if they don't have other legal reasons to stay. And of course, we didn't plan this policy to make people move to Hanover or elsewhere in Niedersachsen.
Hanover is beautiful.
But Hanover is beautiful, and Kassel and Wolfsburg and other beautiful cities around Niedersachsen. But we have to stick to the legislation, and I as a minister has to answer to that legislation, of course, that we passed through, and we regard refugees as someone who has to return when they have a safe place to return to, and we assess along with other European authorities that some Syrians have at the moment, unless they're personally in danger in some way. So I don't agree that the notion that we should be pushing, or we are pushing people to Germany and other places. We're not doing that. We're just following.
No, I didn't say that.
It sounds like that, but that's all right.
That's a consequence.
Yeah, maybe it is, but I think that's a general notion in Denmark, not only in my own party, but also in the center right, that maybe also in Germany, Schaffendas has maybe been a bit too liberal for reality at some point in Merkel's policy. But that's of course a discussion that has to be unfolded, and I think we're more in line with, for example, Austria on those issues.
May I ask you?
No, yes. All right. Sorry. I'm just
Sorry,
trying to get a grab of it. And I agree with you that the Canadian model is succeeding in many ways. One of them is that when you have complete control of people who are arriving in the country, then you can of course also manage in a way that is possible for local communities to cope with, and you can also, as you said earlier, try to solve some other problems with labor market shortage or other issues. But I also think that when Canadians are pointing at European countries and telling them that they're not humane enough, or they're not doing enough enough for refugees, then I think it's important to remember that Canadians are usually, compared to most European countries, that they have a lot less asylum seekers, and
Fully
I don't
agree.
think there's any spontaneous asylum seekers in Canada. They would be very good at rowing or something, but they're taking people through the quota system, and I think my goal, the government's goal in Denmark, is to do the same thing, to make it possible to say to anyone who's asking for spontaneous asylum in Denmark that they have to go to Rwanda or other countries to process that application, and then we are letting in, of course, quota refugees that are the ones who have the highest need for protection. And for example, in Central Africa, there's hundreds of thousands of people who are displaced or refugees in other countries. And I'm not to compare a Burundian refugee with one from Syria. I think both of them have very dire situations, but just saying that it's not necessarily those who arrive at Europe who has the most need for protection. So that's the situation. Of course, we would like to make that at a broader European scale, and I think that is necessary for the long run. But we are also trying to find solutions that we can do within the legal framework we're part of, and as a country not part of the judicial system in the European Union, we have this possibility, and that's why we're trying also to find a solution that way. And we hope that other European countries are inspired by that. So sorry, you can just ask anything, stories. I just had to put it all in the table.
Yes, I would just like to add, yes, indeed. So there is a proposal and working on this outside reception center in third countries. Rwanda is on its way, and this idea was rejected both by Germany and France, I think in 2019, and as you say now, the government is moving forward with it on its own instead of with more European partners. But what is interesting is from the coalition agreement, there is actually a mention of something similar, although more vaguely phrased, about the reception of different, asylum seekers in cooperation with partner countries. And I was interested to hear what lies behind this idea, because I couldn't read more in detail, there were more details. So what is your position on this compared to maybe the Danish proposal? Yeah.
You could not find more details because there aren't. So it is just a commitment to approach that in the coming years. The idea is what Gerald told us before, very similar. The first purpose is to avoid people dying on the sea.
Mike?
Sorry. The first purpose is always to avoid people, to prevent people from dying in the Mediterranean Sea or wherever else they are on their way. And the second purpose is to achieve protection in any kind for people who need that protection and can get it in Europe. But to decide that all in Europe, in Germany or whatever else, with totally different length of procedures, for example, this is a very important purpose too, to shorten the procedures for asylum seekers. In Germany we have, including the court trials, 24 months in average. This is much too long because that causes many problems. We are working on that too. But still, the purpose is to decide about, first to bring them, to prevent them from going on dangerous ships and boats. And to keep them in countries which we have contracted with certain commitments about what's going to happen. So achieving the asylum procedures with the help of UNHCR, for example, or the European Union or whatever else. But in a country which guarantees certain standards. Therefore, Burundi or Rwanda or Syria or whatever, or Libya are not countries in which with which we could really make that. So Tunisia, for example, Algeria, Turkey, even in a certain scale, to make deals with them, to take care for the procedures, to take care for the people who are successful with applying for asylum and then take them over to Europe. Because the solution can't be to make the procedure abroad and then let them go anywhere. They can, of course, decide to leave in the country in which they arrive, but those who won't have to get the opportunity to go to Europe. And if they are in Europe, we have the duty to take care for the distribution. From my point of view, everybody who finds protection in Europe and is looking for a better and safer life than he had before, he has to accept that we decide where he lives in Europe. You can't go and then say, it's so beautiful in the Black Forest in Germany, or it's so beautiful in the Bretagne in France. I only want to live there. This won't work on the long run, because we are a European space, and we have to solve the problem together. And that means standards, social standards, which are comparable and so on. And that is the purpose. We are just in the beginning of that. We just started to discuss it in the Federal Minister of Interior and with some politicians in our government and parliament. And it's not so easy, because you have to define which country might be possible, what is the work we have to do before even starting negotiations. What are the offers we can make? For example, educational matters in Tunisia, how we can improve the educational and school system to make more people capable to stay in Tunisia instead of, for example, to leave Tunisia either as Tunisians or other nationalities. So this is the purpose we have, and therefore this is a difference. I understand your purpose too, but the difference is the way to try to reach it. And I think we should rather look for the European solution in the way like we try to describe it.
But I think the obvious difficulty in these things always lies in actually making them work, as we saw with Turkey. But we also know that in principle it should be possible to make it work. Why is that? Let me focus on one issue that is a lot in the debate on border control, which is returns. I mean, returns are central. If we don't have returns, why do we have an asylum system? If it doesn't matter whether people need protection or not, then we don't need to have protection. Those who come from the state. On the other hand, we all know realistically that returns are incredibly difficult to do. I don't know how many Syrians actually return from Denmark to Syria. Probably not many.
I don't remember the number.
But probably very few, if any. And I know that Germany has big problems returning people to many countries in the world. So does France, so does Spain, so does Italy, so does Sweden. We've analyzed the countries to whom returns happen in larger numbers. And it's very interesting. Germany returns 80% of the people who are returned, forced returns, to other European countries. Balkans, Moldova, before the war, Moldova, Ukraine, Georgia, the Balkans, Russia. Now, France returns a few people to North Africa, but not that many, a few thousand. Almost none south of the Sahara. The same is true for Italy. I mean, even the tough interior minister, Salvini, didn't even try to return people to Africa. The reason for this is because returns are so incredibly difficult to do, as we've seen in Germany. I mean, I wrote in my book a whole chapter on the Gambians, who are now in Germany, who no longer need protection. They're impossible to return because the Gambia doesn't cooperate. And they don't cooperate. So they don't get into, if they are getting into a plane, they just don't sit down, and the pilot in Germany says, I throw you out again. I can't take you. If they have a charter flight, the Gambian government doesn't allow the charter to land. That happens all the time. The reality is all countries in Europe have that problem. So my question is, as a realist who says, okay, we need return, but return in a humane way, we should have the fewest possible returns for the maximum impact on irregular migration. And that we have if we have returns after a cut-off date. So we say, of course, we focus on Gefährder, those who pose a threat. We focus on those who commit a crime. We focus on That is clear. On this, everybody agrees. But beyond that, if we focus on a cut-off date, if we say from now on, those who arrive and do not need protection will be returned. That, historically, we see many examples, can have huge impact on future arrivals. So with few returns, and that, for example, makes it much easier to reach an agreement. I remember when we talked to the Turks in 2015-16, they proposed then the cut-off date to the Europeans. They said, okay, we're prepared to take people, but only after the 18th of March. All who arrive before you have to keep. That makes it more realistic, because then we have a few returns. So that means that for humane policy, the two difficulties then lie. How can one, let's take the central Mediterranean as the deadliest border in the world. And the people that arrive there, they go to Germany or Denmark or Sweden or France or Italy. If one could, in the central Mediterranean, increase sea rescues, rescue people fast, so as few as possible cry for help and don't get rescued. If we want to do this without Libya, because in Libya people are being tortured, the only way to achieve this is if we persuade Tunisia that we and they rescue, and that those that are rescued, we can bring to Tunisia so that when we rescue people, it doesn't lead to more people risking their lives. That we then offer resettlement, but at the same time we offer Tunisia something attractive, the package. You know, we talked to the Ministry of Economy, Development and Solar Energy, Ministry of Labor, legal work migration, like Germany has offered the Balkans. You know, people from the Balkans who find a job can all come. Why not to Tunisians? We have these 400,000 jobs needed. And I'm sure other countries in Europe can do the same. And most importantly, we can offer perhaps Tunisia something that we've offered to Ukraine 10 years ago, and they got it in 2017, visa-free travel for tourists. If they take back everybody who has to leave, then we can return to what they had 20 years ago, which is visa-free travel for Tunisians. Which actually they had with Italy, until Italy joined Schengen. This package would be so attractive to Tunisians that then we can put conditions and say, yes, but in return, first of all, the people that are returned need to be treated well. There needs to be an asylum procedure. We will help you also with bringing refugees to Europe. This kind of thing strikes me, and I talked to the Austrian Minister of Interior last week, is something where Germany, Denmark, Austria, France, Italy actually have a common interest, because this fits with the philosophy of the coalition agreement. It fits with the philosophy of what I read in the text by the Danish Ministry of Interior, to reduce irregular migration, to save lives. It saves lives, it doesn't do so at the expense of deaths at sea, and we can get out of Libya. We can stop relying on Libyan militias. If that becomes a project, I think it would be great to have a team that seriously thinks through how this could work. If it works in the central Mediterranean, where last year 1,200 people died, just there, making this work would save 1,000 lives a year. And save the refugee convention in our honor, because we no longer rely on Frontex telling the Libyans where people are and they're taken back to camps where they're being tortured, by Libyan militias. That, I think, is realistic on return, realistic on control, and is humane. And that's something worth pushing for. And if I talked to the Austrians, they were, I mean, you know, they are not, they think this makes sense. Then they say, but talk to the Danes. I said, I don't know, I'm coming here. So.
Great. You, of course, have to get to respond to that. I just want to flag up if there's questions. The discussion is also open, so you can start thinking if you have any questions for our great panel. But of course, the floor is yours to answer.
Well, of course, usually when the Austrians say something, they usually want the same league opinion. So I think, and we're also, of course, one of the countries that we're discussing these matters with. But I haven't thought it through, and it hasn't been assessed by my ministry. I think, of course, it makes sense and to have a common European solution. If we can get to that conclusion, that would be much better than having individual agreements. But just to on the thing you started with was returns, and that has been one thing that my predecessor and also one of my most important tasks is to make that system work better. And I think actually we did it better than much better than it was before. We have return centers where people who haven't got any legal reason to stay in Denmark are put when that are returning to the country where they have to return to, and we reduced the people in those centers from around 1,200 to around 750 in the past 2 years. Some countries are very difficult, of course. Syria is one of them. We don't have any agreements with the government in Syria, obviously. Afghanistan, another example. Iran, also a country where it's difficult to return people to, but in other countries it might, with the work that makes sense and with trying to find, for example, in Iran, the right documentation. People who have passports with documented Iranian citizens, then they can return them also if they're not willing to do it, but by with the assistance from the police. But I think also there's a lot of principle in this case, because we have a system where the foreign agency decides if you have the right to stay in Denmark, and then many people appeal to not court, but we have a judge at least from the courts who makes the decisions inside that. And when you get a no and you don't have a legal reason to stay in Denmark, if everyone can say, I want to stay anyway, then of course no one wants to return ever. And I think making this system work is also the key to actually helping those who have personally or as a group need for protection in Denmark and other European countries. So I think we do get some results, but of course when we talk about Syrians, it's very difficult to return people to a country where you don't have any agreements with the government. I don't remember the number. I can give you the numbers for all different countries around the Middle East and Northern Africa, mostly those countries. Because I think it's also, it would be tragic if people who don't have legal reasons to stay here get to stay here while other people who actually have a very large need for protection in Central Africa and Middle East, where they're not getting those places. So that's just a few numbers.
Any quick responses, or should we take?
Yes, of course. No, just different. I fully agree. Not everybody who comes to us can finally stay. Of course not. And of course of course not everybody can stay. And therefore we have in our coalition treaty really a commitment. We are launching a repatriation offensive to implement departures more consistently, in particular the deportation of criminals and dangerous persons, but also others. I absolutely agree. We do have to do that, because otherwise the acceptance of what we do in refugee politics and migration politics will decrease incredibly. So we have to do that. There's no dissent between us. It's the only thing I want to tell.
Thank you for that. Then I would like to open the floor for questions. If there's already one here, then let's take the first.
So my question is primarily to Danish. My question is primarily to the Danish minister. So it's my first time in Copenhagen, and the extreme wealth of the city and the comfort of the lives of the people I've seen around me has been very spectacular and disappointing itself as well. But this has kind of not really fit so well in my mind with how you described Danish migration policy. So just to start with that, but I have two hopefully less personal questions. So the first is around the idea or examples that outsourcing of border policing and the securitization of borders we've seen within the EU has led, or that the EU opened blackmail. We have like the recent examples of Turkey, Bosnia, Belarus, Morocco, all weaponizing migration flows or forcing political and financial concessions. So I wondered, because you spoke so much of removing negative incentive structures, how continuing to increase our outsourcing of this issue fixes this. Because from how I see it, it only worsens it.
Yes, go ahead. And maybe you can include some of the questions as well. I'm not sure if everybody will do it. So the outsourcing of migration policy and how that adds to whether it adds to the incentives or not.
Well, I think, and maybe we disagree, I think that we in Denmark has taken many refugees. We still take many displaced people from Ukraine at the moment. There's a very low number who has been refused to stay in Denmark in that crisis, just as in the Syrian refugees crisis 6 years ago. So I don't agree. There are many European countries who has a lot lower numbers compared to the number of citizens in the countries. But I think it's an obligation for us that we have a system of asylum, but also residency that is fair and is based on who has the most needs for asylum. And I don't think that the system today makes that end. And of course, this securitization of borders is part of also having borders. If you have a border between two countries and you don't somehow enforce that border, then it's not in the end a border, then it's just a line on a map. If Lithuania don't have a border to Belarus that is somewhat guarded so that Lithuania has control with who gets into their country, then at some point I think Lithuania would be threatened by the people who cross the border. So of course the notion of a nation state, if you support that notion, and of course that has been changing through the history of our world, but the notion of a nation state is based on control of borders and control of who enters and who exits the nation. If you can't do that, then you don't have any possibility in a democratic elected government in Europe anywhere to make decisions, because then everyone else is making decisions, whether it's human smugglers or if it's other cartels. And I think that's also part of the discussion. And of course, I also see some threats, as was mentioned also in Knaus's presentation. And I think it's very important to be aware of all the human rights violations that are along these routes and also in other countries that are dealing with it. But I don't think that necessarily it only stems from securitization of borders as its main cause.
Can I just add one thing to this? I mean, there is, if you look at the Aegean, there are three options. There is a boat coming, any boat coming from Turkey to Greece. And like in the period of 2015, any boat that arrives, sorry.
It's all broken.
Speak in short verses.
You have to shout.
It's the Russians.
Okay, we'll speak very loudly then.
So if you take the Aegean, you have three options. I mean, simply, you have boats that leave Turkey, and you say any boat that arrives on the Greek islands stays in Greece or stays in the EU. That is what we had for 1 year. That's when 1,100 people died, and that's when in Europe there was at the end, almost every government said we need to stop this. I mean, there was an agreement, and the proposal that was popular to stop it was to have pushbacks in the Balkans. You know, that was the idea of Sebastian Kurz and Viktor Orban. Let's push people back at the Balkan borders. Now, the second option is what we have now. Every boat that arrives is being, or almost every, is pushed back by force. Then you cannot be blackmailed. Greece is not blackmailed by Turkey, because it just uses force unilaterally. That is a major argument in Greece to make this popular, this policy. It's that, see, we can no longer be blackmailed, we have control, we push everyone back. But it is a violation of Greek law, EU law, international law. The third option is the hardest, but it's the only way to have humane control, is that you try to negotiate with the other country. Now, there are countries you can't do that. Like, you can't negotiate with Belarus, and you can't negotiate with Libya. You could negotiate with Turkey, which has given 3.7 million people protection. You know, it's clearly a country where you can have protection. But the details matter a lot. You know, can you monitor what happens to the people you send back, etc.
But either you have open borders with no control, which no democracy in the world has open borders for everyone. Even Canada and the US have still borders after 200 years. Only in Europe we have Schengen, you know that. But so either you have open borders with no control, which I don't think is sustainable, or you have most borders in the world are forced closure by violence, like all around Afghanistan. Iran pushes people back, Pakistan pushes people, Turkmenistan, everybody. Or you do the hardest, but the only way of humane control, which is agreements. And this term, externalization or outsourcing, is then very misleading because it covers both the cynical deal with Libya and an honest agreement with another country, Tunisia, where you preserve the right to asylum and care about human dignity. But you do it to stop people dying and to have control. Both is outsourcing, both is externalization, but one is in line with the Refugee Convention and the other is not. So just to give one example of Australia. The Australians have famously a policy of pushing everyone back. And there were huge human costs. And I talked to the people who were in Nauru and Manus. You know, for 7 years, Australian doctors said this was like torture. But then you talk to the Australian government, and I had conversations with some people who make this policy. They say, you Europeans are hypocrites. You know, in 1 year, 4,600 people died just in the Mediterranean. Nobody died in Australia in 2016 on the water. So they say that our policy, their policy is bad, ours is worse. And they had a point. I mean, it's true, in 2016, Europe's policy was, even now I say Europe's policy is more cruel. Does that mean the Australians had no alternative? No, I think they had an alternative. The Labour government in Australia tried to negotiate an agreement with Malaysia, not with Nauru, to say from now on, a cut-off date, we take people back to Malaysia, and in Malaysia, UNHCR should do the asylum procedure. This agreement was signed by Malaysia, it was signed by Australia, and UNHCR endorsed it 10 years ago. We have this in my book and it's on our website. There was a press statement from UNHCR saying, it's not great, but it's much better than loss of life and what was done before. The reason the Malaysia agreement then in the end could never be implemented was because you needed a change in the law in Australia, and the Labour Party did not have the majority. The Conservatives said, no returns to Malaysia, because then we have to take people from Malaysia. That was the deal. You take more refugees from Malaysia than you send back. But not the same, different ones, orderly. The Conservatives said, no, we don't want that. Let's just put them in Nauru like before. And the Green Party, which could have given it the majority in the Australian Parliament, said no returns. What happened in the end was the worst outcome. The Labour government lost the elections. This was a big issue. The Conservatives came in, and what they did was everyone to Nauru and Manus, everyone stays there until forever. They succeeded. They didn't do any processing with UNHCR like in Malaysia. It stopped the flows, but it was incredibly cruel. So I think the real debate we need to have, also in the expert community, is which forms of cooperation are better than others. And never forget how many people die when we don't have any cooperation. This is a real number. And I was recently invited by one of the biggest German groups, Sea Rescue, private sea rescue organizations. They had their annual meeting and we had a very good debate, CI. And you know, they are very committed. These people are their own money, their own time, they're not paid, and they're rescuing people at sea. And they're rescuing a lot of lives. But they're not happy with the current policy. They rescue a few hundred people a year, perhaps now, because nobody helps them. There's no attending. They see other people dying, and they see 30,000 people being taken back to Libya. But most importantly, what they fear is they don't see anymore that their news about what's happening, the death, the suffering, changes policy in Europe. Everybody's used to it. Everybody says, there's nothing we can do. That's why I was encouraged by the German coalition agreement, which says, no, we can do something. We should have more rescues, work with countries that are acceptable, but then have another policy of stopping the increase. I think even a lot of humanitarian organizations are getting ready to have this debate. You know, if it's only open borders or closed borders will always win. But the debate is, how do we have control that is humane? I mean, that's the challenge. That's why, and the blackmail argument, the only way we cannot be blackmailed is either with totally open borders or with totally closed ones by violence. Otherwise, we are always depending on others. I mean, that's normal. That's diplomacy.
And I think the mics are working again.
Okay, but I've spoken too long.
You had a question from Nicholas, and feel free to introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Nick Tan. I'm a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights here in Copenhagen. I have questions for all of the panelists. So first, Minister Dybvad, what is your reaction to the UK-Rwanda asylum partnership agreement signed recently? Is this essentially a forerunner to the Danish model, or are there important distinctions between the UK arrangement and the Danish proposal? And secondly, if a Rwanda transfer mechanism is implemented, is the government concerned about Dublin cooperation? Because it seems to me that not only does the model rely on the Danish government finding Rwanda to be safe, but indeed for Dublin cooperation to continue, that neighbouring countries would agree with that assessment. To Minister Pistorus, thank you very much for your interventions. My question is a clarifying one. Is your vision for these pre-arrival asylum procedures with respect only to those who cross the Mediterranean, so after disembarkation, or does your agreement foresee access to asylum at diplomatic posts or EU facilities on the way to Europe? Thank you. And Mr. Knaus, finally, so with respect to your proposal around third country arrangements in the central Mediterranean, of course, the legal questions here become around, say, third country rules. And as you would know, under EU asylum law, there's a requirement of a genuine connection to the country and a reasonableness requirement to send people there. So my question is, would your solution require legislative amendment at EU level, or are you talking about transfers back to countries of transit? And a final point for you, of course we can all agree increased resettlement is a desirable aim here. The problem for a person like me, a refugee lawyer, is to me resettlement is like a tap. It's a policy solution that can be turned on and off. There are no legal obligations to resettle a single person globally. So how do we ensure binding commitments to resettlement? Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, regarding the UK, we don't know the specific details of the legal arrangements that they have made with the Rwanda. And of course, we need to do that before we can assess if it's some of the same agreements that we've been working on. Of course, the UK is a much larger country with a much larger diplomatic base and muscle, so they have a better opportunities for making this kind of agreement. But we're trying to continue the negotiations that we have, or the talks that we've been having with Rwanda for the past period, and it's not affected by the UK agreement, as I see it. It's a different track for us than it was for them, not because we don't see some of the same elements, but just because it has been for them also a much shorter period, because it is a big country with more opportunities, of course, in making these kind of agreements. But of course, when we work in the same, we're watching and trying to learn something also, if there is something to learn from it. And regarding the Dublin Convention, as I understood it, there's been concerns around the human rights situation and around the different EU rules and regulations, and we're trying also, that has been the statement from the government also when we released this plan, when we were in a position that we have to, of course, respect human rights and obligations and other international agreements that we've been part of, or is part of. And then that's the offset for it. And there might be other concerns than those that have already been raised by other European countries, and we'll, of course, enter into discussions, because we're part of the same continent, and we want to make our partners in the European Union safe in what we're doing, but also another part of it is that while some are concerned, there are also other European Union members who are also inspired by what we're doing, trying or looking at least to how we're moving forward, because they at some point might also, or I don't think you can say that they're necessarily interested in the same sort of agreement, but they're interested in looking if we can achieve that. So there are different views, and we will of course try to get into dialogue with those who are concerned.
Yes, and the UK is definitely further ahead in their process. And so far, Denmark has a memorandum of understanding, which is not, it's a first deal, but it's not really about the issue itself. But the future will tell us how far that goes. Then let's go to questions.
Thank you. The second question first. Of course, this is conceivable too for other routes of refugees. Well, I think we should do one step after the other. And first question, I beg your pardon when I say I estimate what the British authorities, the British politics presented us is rather political theatre, political performance than a real contract, or even more. I don't think that would work a single day like it is presented.
Well, the first question you have is very correct, very straightforward, very factual, a very easy answer, because it's about EU law and Article 38(2)(a) of the directive. Yes, that would need to be changed. And when I was invited during the coalition talks to present some ideas, that's one of the things I presented. I also discussed this with Danish representatives when they came to Berlin, that it makes perfect sense to say what we should focus on is actually the human rights situation. You know, are people safe? But a connection that I don't understand. It's not in Danish law. It's not in the Refugee Convention. It's not necessary. And UNHCR didn't seek it when it gave this press release on the Malaysia agreement. So I think that should be changed. What is more important is the control mechanisms afterwards. You know, because it's very easy to say we just send people somewhere and they're forgotten. We've had some examples like this. Israel had such an agreement with Rwanda. There is a chance in Europe, if we would take our own laws seriously, the European Convention on Human Rights, you know, unfortunately we're breaking it even inside the EU. I mean, what Croatia is doing is obviously a violation of the European Convention. But it actually provides some sort of requirement on us, you know, to check these things. And I think we should take that seriously. On resettlement and commitments, I think that, you know, what is so interesting is at the moment, if we look at irregular migration into Europe, the last 4 years it's been around 100,000 people a year, roughly, that cross the Mediterranean. You know, Spain, Italy, Malta, Greece, Cyprus, about 100,000. I don't know how many of them end up getting protection, either refugee status, subsidiary protection, but looking at the nationalities that are now crossing, I would be surprised if it's more than half, because the top nationalities are Tunisians, you know, Egyptians, Moroccans, Algerians, Bangladeshis, not countries that have a high recognition rate. But let's say it's half. That means about 50,000 people who in the end get protection reach Europe in this way. That's a very small number. I mean, any system of resettlement where I was a member of a committee, the Fluchtursachenkommission of the last government, and there was an SPD and a CSU politician, Christian Democrat and Social Democrat, who chaired it, and the committee agreed to recommend that European countries should aim to resettle at least as many people every year as Sweden, which resettles 5,000 a year, which is 0.05% of its population. For Germany, there would be 40,000. For France, 30,000. I don't know for Denmark. Well, Sweden would be 2,000. You know, 2,500 a year resettlement. If you add this, the Benelux, the Nordics, Germany, France, just those countries, you end up with 100,000 refugees being brought into, and these numbers don't shock anyone. 100,000 refugees getting safe passage to Europe
through resettlement. If you add a few other countries, it would be even more. The US is promising 150,000 a year. Canada is promising 30,000. Is doing. So we could actually get through resettlement real numbers. The guarantee that it is being done is politics, but that is also the guarantee that the Refugee Convention is being implemented, as we see in Greece. The Greek courts cannot stop the Greek government doing pushbacks. Croatian courts are not stopping the Croatian government doing pushbacks. Polish courts are not stopping. The thing is that when the politics has decided, Hungary, same example, when there's strong political will to actually break the rule. I don't think in Germany it would work, and I think in Denmark it would work. But in a lot of countries in Europe, that's enough. The courts are powerless, which is actually a disaster for the rule of law. I mean, it's disastrous what Orban is doing, just saying, I ignore the court. But in the end, there is no guarantee for politics. And what we see with the Ukrainians is so interesting, is when a lot of the public has a sense that there are people that really need protection, and you hear about it because the media report a lot. Empathy is enormous. And I heard from friends in Germany that even on Afghans, when there was a lot of reporting last year on Afghans in danger, there were lots of Germans who were volunteering, we could house Afghans too. I don't think it's just, it's easy, it's just racism. No, for Syrians there was a lot of support in Germany. Gambians, if I go around Baden-Württemberg now, where there are a lot of Gambians, there are so many Germans who've been working with these Gambians for 5 years, who'll be the first to demonstrate against deportations, because they know them. I think it's when you hear about refugees a lot that you develop empathy. That is the best. So what the Canadians have managed to do is create a system where almost every Canadian knows somebody who's taken in somebody. So there is a broad support because they all know, it works, it's controlled. And that might in itself create a guarantee that it continues. See what I mean? I don't think we can have a legal guarantee, but a working system that is controlled and humane makes it politically more likely that it not only continues for decades, as in Canada, but can be built upon.
I would like just to add one point to the question of resettlement. As I mentioned, I am one of the ministers the most long time in service. That means I'm older, but I still remember. And, I remember 2013-14 when I just had come in office. And the Syrian crisis, the Syrian war was in full run. And in our conference of the Ministers of Interior in Germany, which takes place twice a year, with the federal minister together, we discuss every time what are we going to do with the refugees from Syria. And me and my colleague, we suggested let's take some contingents from Jordania, from Lebanon, at least 100, 150,000, orderly, with the support of UNHCR and other organizations. Vulnerable groups, families with children, and so on and so on. And the Conservatives responsible for the Federal Ministry of the Interior at that time always refused. They said, 10,000, 50,000. This was more or less, I don't want to say ridiculous, but homeopathic. Yeah? And therefore we couldn't really solve the problem, and we forced the people on the Balkan route finally, because nobody really has the hope to come out. The situation in those camps in Jordania and Lebanon became worse and worse, especially because Western countries, United States and others, reduced their payments. So the situation became worse and worse, and the people were almost forced to leave. And because there were no contingents, no reliable agreements with European countries or others, that didn't work, because 10,000, 15,000, it's not really much. If you consider how many people still are living in Jordania or in Lebanon. And this is an example for how we can really fail with our politics if we make the wrong decisions in an early point of time.
Before I would like to be forward-looking on what we can do for the future, I'd like to see, is there a final question from the audience? Only facing one, yes?
Yes, I hope you can all hear me. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation, this debate. I have a few questions, and there's been so many thoughts throughout this, but I would like to start with the Danish minister. because we keep hearing that European countries, you want to inspire other European countries to pursue Danish policies. Now, I witnessed I saw the invitation that your predecessor Tesfaye received to talk about the MOU that Denmark has with Rwanda in the European Parliament. There wasn't much support coming from the European Parliament, and it was quite clear that there wasn't any inspiration being drawn from Danish idea. So I'm just wondering if you could elaborate on which countries you're envisioning would be inspired by us. And also, we keep mentioning the juridical opt-out, which is an opt-out from the European Corporation, and when we hear our partners and our neighbours talking about we should have a European solution, even you also say we should have a European solution to this problem. How do you envision the future with the European solution and a Danish juridical opt-out? Because I think that's quite key actually to a future and a common solution. And finally, I think just want to say thank you so much to the Minister from the Lower Saxony. I think your approach is very nice and very good, and keep seeking this European solution and shared approach. And I was just curious to actually hear the very concrete proposal that we've heard today. Is that something that you would be inspired by to take forward? Thank you so much.
Yeah, we can start with you.
To be honest, some of the points in our coalition treaty was developed in discussions with Gerald. So I'm not in the position to say it's all my idea or our ideas. We talked about it several times, and I took over his, not in all prospects of course, his point of view, his perspective, but I'm finally convinced that the attempts of solutions of the last decade failed, more or less, including Dublin. So what are we going to do now in the future? That's the question, and therefore we have to try new ways.
Is there anything you want to add on your involvement?
Well, it also helped in Germany, certainly. I don't know how that is in every other country. I found that in all the major parties, leaving out the far right, which is fortunately really declining to below 5% in some of the states recently, and perhaps leaving out the far left, which is divided, but some are really for open borders and some are not, but they're also very weak. But in the mainstream parties, there are fortunately some key people, especially in those coalition agreements, that really wanted to solve problems. And so you could really present facts. I found this a really interesting atmosphere. The Greens were there, but they are also governing in parts of Germany. They also know that you need control, but they are right to say you want humane control. But that's again what Social Democrats have said too. And then there were liberals who are in the government in Germany. They say, well, we have all these people here that we know we will not be able to deport. Let's give them a chance. Which then again, Social Democrats, yeah, we want. So I think if we take this debate back out of the ideological, it becomes possible to find solutions, and it becomes very important that you have a political elite across parties, because in the end you need a broad coalition. In Germany, this needs to be decided. Bundestag, many Länder.
Very complicated.
So you need many people, but it's important that the whole debate moves in this direction, being less ideological, more focusing on what you said at the very beginning. The status quo is really unacceptable. The status quo is terrible. Deadly, illegal, and too few people get protection. If one can change this pragmatically and bring people along, we should try.
Thank you, and thank you also for the questions. I think that it's a very important part of our institutions in the European Union that you can go to the Libyan committee and get you challenged and be challenged by the members there. But I also think that it might be an exaggeration to put an equality between, or to put the Libyan committee members as representatives of the countries and the country's governments. I'd say, at least for our own Danish MEPs, I'd say that they're not at all times in line with the government and issues, and European issues. And of course, members of the Libyan committee might also be of different opinion with their governments. But I think it's important that we have these discussions, and also that members from my own party group in the European Parliament and their challenging the policies that we plan. But I say that the governments around Europe are not necessarily bound by what their legal committee members have said, and I think that just as some countries are concerned, there are other countries that they are looking to where our plans are going at the moment. I wouldn't point them out because I think that the discussions that we have, both with positive-minded, negative-minded countries, are also something that they should be having with us without me delivering them in conference and other places. So just to say that of course, as in many other cases, there are different opinions among EU member states. And regarding the opt-outs, now we're about to vote on one of our opt-outs in Denmark, and my party is also cheering for campaigning for yes in that issue, but I don't think that. I think as long as we have judicial opt-out, then of course we have to stay in line with the limitations that we have. Also, if other European countries are making corporations that we can't take part of, then that's part of the playing field. That's the limits of the playing field that we're entering. So I think that's just the conditions as Danish politicians. We have opt-outs, and some of them has been tried to be removed or being cancelled as the official one, but the population didn't want it, so we have to play by those rules.
Thank you. Then I just have a final question, actually for all of you, so we will keep it brief. But actually it links very well to what you said, because I wanted to ask about the reception of Ukrainians across Europe, in Denmark, Germany, but in all other countries. This has led to the EU creating this, or activated the Temporary Protection Directive, and as you said, this is, well, not something we are part of, but the Danish Parliament government, they enacted a law that is very similar to the European one, so especially Ukrainian law, you could call it. And my question to all of you is, are there any lessons from the handling of Ukrainian refugees and these special laws that are now in place that change your perspective on migration law and migration policy in general? Because this reception has been, I think I can say, dramatically different than, for example, with Syrian refugees, at least in Denmark. I'm not an expert in all the other countries, but both in terms of the rights that they have and the fact that they don't have to wait in asylum centers for sometimes up to 19 months. That was the average waiting time for Syrian refugees. So the question is a bit open, but has the Ukrainian reception, has that changed any perspectives on refugee policy, migration policy? Is there anyone who wants to start? Because I wanted to ask all three of you. Yeah.
Do you have an easier question? Because I was overwhelmed myself too by the helpfulness, the willingness to help, the reception, the warm welcome all over Europe, especially in Poland and other countries in Eastern Europe. Therefore, there was a moment or a couple of days in which I really hoped and believed that might have an impact, a positive impact for the future migration politics in Europe. But to be honest, I'm not sure about that any longer, because during the last week I was in the committee in the 4th of April when that directive went in charge, or was put in charge, however you say. And that was a an atmosphere of much unity. A couple of weeks later, 3 weeks later, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, I don't remember exactly, the discussion came up, what about distributing the people from Ukraine all over Europe, besides the fact that they can choose their place to live or to stay at least for a couple of months freely. But still the discussion came up because Poland took so many and Germany took so many and so on. And then we very quickly learned that there were some, I tried to express this diplomatically, we had at once the reflex, the first response to say, if we do that now, we might be forced to do it in another migration situation in 2 or 3 years too, with refugees not from our backyard. And therefore that never happens. That's at least my point of view and my state of information. And therefore I'm not sure about that. Imagine a new war anywhere in the Middle East or far, wherever else. I don't mind. Happens again, and like in 15, 16, 2 or 3 or 4 million, at least so many Syrians start to flee their country. I'm not sure whether that will be the same with the Ukrainians now. At least I'm not sure about that. I will be friendly. So therefore I'm not so optimistic, but as we say in matters of football, the hope dies the last. So let's hope.
Well, I say that I disagree with the notion that there's a big difference between how the atmosphere was in 2015 and how it is today. The Ukrainians, I think that when you look back at the newspaper articles and some of the different discussions back then, I remember we had in Denmark a policeman playing with a child in the highway in southern Zealand somewhere. I think there was also a very positive atmosphere for many people, or at least for a long period of time when it was the case, and also when you look back to the Bosnians and 90s and other groups. But I'd say that we face some of the same difficulties with Ukrainians as we did with Syrians. There's a very low number getting into work. There are language barriers that are quite steep. There are other issues that is not easy to handle as a government, and that requires a lot of attention. We have had a special law in Denmark. We did that before time. We also had a special law for Bosnians and Palestinians back in those days. But that does give some parts of the process. It gives some better conditions, and some parts it gives them worse conditions. And of course, there's also been a debate here: are we treating people better than other groups of refugees? I'd say when it comes to residency, they are treated better, but they also in a visa agreement with the European Union, so it's difficult to make the same setup. But when it comes to, for example, the welfare schemes, then we have made part of the law that can degrade the level of welfare services, kindergartens. Of course, everyone needs medical help, getting medical help, but sort of the overall welfare services that you get as a citizen in Denmark, those are being put on a lower level for Ukrainians, because those are so big numbers that we expected 100,000 in Denmark, and we don't have doctors and kindergarten teachers and whatever they need to live and have life in Denmark. So that's also part of the discussion. It's not because we don't want them to have just as good a service as everyone else, it's just because we don't have the employees to deliver it.
Well, I think the biggest single difference, and that shows us something that I think has been neglected in the whole debate on refugees, biggest single difference is what happened years before this crisis, which is the visa-free travel for Ukrainians. Because that basically created a moment that interior ministers, and I know I talked to some of them, and also in that session when they decided, they basically said they're coming anyways. You know, we have visa-free travel, they're coming anyways. Nobody thought to close the border. You know, there was nobody was. So, well, if you don't revoke the visa-free travel, which would have been cruel and impossible, nobody did that, then they're coming anyways. Then the question is just, what do we do once they arrive? And in the first week, 1 million people arrived in the EU. So it was clear that any asylum system, you know, Polish asylum system takes a few thousand decisions a year, right? So any asylum system will collapse. That is the end of asylum for the next 2 years, or 5 years, or 10 years. You know, everybody will be busy
And it would be stupid, because why do you take the time decision you can't return anyone? So what's the point? So in a way, by allowing visa-free travel, which of course Syrians never had, or Afghans, or by allowing visa-free travel years before, the whole debate started from a different perspective. And that's, I mean, it was really impressive, you know, not only them, also Switzerland passed it, it doesn't have to, but it basically passed the same temporary protection law, something very similar. Because once you have freedom of movement and visa-free travel, and there was visa-free travel to Switzerland as well, you know, what do the Swiss do? If everybody arrives and then applies for asylum, you know, they said, no, you can also get it immediately. That made a lot of sense. And so I think this is the biggest, this is why I also think, you know, working on visa-free travel, which I know, you know, I've done this for 10 years with ministers of interior. We had former ministers of interior at that time, Otto Schilly, Giuliano Amato from Italy, Charles Clark from the United Kingdom, informally advising us on how to argue the case for visa-free travel, so that interior ministers, their colleagues, could defend this in parliaments as something that makes Europe safer, not less safe. And they said, well, the way to do that is to argue that visa-free travel, through cooperation and standards, including standards on return, but also standards on human rights, you know, etc. Moldova had to pass a non-discrimination LGBT law to get visa-free travel. Well, they did pass it. If you have a long list of conditions, visa-free travel can enhance control and can make us more secure. You have more cooperation with the police, better documents, better. So this argument you could win. I think this is why I think now having a debate on visa-free travel for the first African country. There's no African country that has visa-free travel to the European Union now. None. All of Latin America can travel visa-free, except for Cuba and Bolivia, I think. Everyone. You know, Honduras, Venezuela can come visa-free. Nobody from Africa. Having a debate under what conditions Tunisians, as a middle-income country basically, if they cooperate, if they make reforms, if they take back people who have to leave, could get visa-free travel for tourists again, this would give us enormous leverage to achieve other goals from sea rescue to return. And I think this is a lesson of the Ukrainians, that having visa-free travel before the crisis makes handling the crisis in this respect very different. My second point is, we see again how hard it is to distribute refugees against their will. You know, the one failure of Dublin was that Dublin said people have to be somewhere, but then we were not able to move them there. Nobody was able to move. You know, Germany can move people to France and Norway moves them to Germany, that works. But moving people to Italy or Spain or Greece never worked. Never. Look at the numbers. Greece got 100 people in 10 years from the north of Europe under Dublin. You know, that's ridiculous. Sweden had per capita the highest number of protection it was given. 2.5 times higher than Italy in the last 10 years. You know, Sweden gave much more protection than Italy, where people arrive. If Dublin would have worked, that would not be the case. Dublin never worked. So it doesn't work because it's so hard to fix people to a place they don't want to be in. What the Ukrainian situation shows us now is that it's not good laissez-faire, but we need something in the middle. We need voluntary efforts to distribute people. Now, anybody in Europe who said, in a city that says we want to take Ukrainians, Madrid, Dublin, Lisbon, Valencia, the legal situation is there. All you need to do is inform people in Poland or Moldova or Romania, you could come to Madrid, there's place.
But they don't come.
But they don't, well, because they don't get that information. I was just in Moldova and I talked to people, there are 2,500 places for Norway, right? For Norway, for Ukrainian refugees, the poorest country in Europe, where many of the households they're staying in are very poor. But these Ukrainians don't know much about Norway. You know, they don't know anything about Norway actually. And why would a woman with a child get into a plane to a country she knows nothing about, where they don't speak Russian, they speak Russian. But if you explain, listen, you could go to Norway, this is how it would work, there are the schools, this is the support you could get, I'm sure you could take 2,500 people on planes to Norway. So here civil society has now a real chance to prove how this could work. Voluntary, city to city. But we're not using it. There's not enough of this. I mean, that's another lesson. Last lesson is, if we manage, Europeans manage to handle 4 million, 5 million, we don't know in the end, but a few million people in a very short period, and we remember, and it's not chaos. And in Germany, nobody feels it's chaos. You know, it was really tough, but it's working. Well, why are we then afraid of 100,000 people a year? You know, it puts things in perspective. Right? If we can deal with 5 million people, 100,000 with the right policy that cross the Mediterranean, we return a few, we deal with, it becomes manageable. I hope that's the lesson.
And with those words, let's hope that there's grounds for cooperation between countries and with civil society as well. Thank you for a fruitful discussion, and thank you for all your questions. And thank you for joining us today. And I know some of them were both in the morning session and afternoon session, so well done for joining both, or one. And yes, so thank you from us, thank you to our panel. Great pleasure and honor to have you here. And if anyone wants to have a short tour of the Parliament, you can stay in here and we'll take a walk around. And otherwise, you're free, and thank you. That's it.
Thank you to you and to Francesca, to Edi for organizing all of this. It's been very impressive. In this beautiful room with such a group of people. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.